Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Lisa Watson, member of City Club's Board of Governors. For over 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you joining us through KGW's website, Facebook feed, or news app, X-Ray FM, or on Open Signal's community media television stations. The generous support of City Club's media partners and corporate sponsors enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to recognize City Club's fall sponsors, Avangrid Renewables and Morel Inc. And I'd also like to thank today's event sponsor, First Interstate Bank. In 2017, the Oregon Legislature passed an unprecedented $5.3 billion transportation package. We are here today to talk about this bill, Oregon's largest investment in transportation infrastructure and programs, and in particular, what it means for the metro region. What are the big wins, near misses, and shifts in philosophy? How does this package contribute to our reputation as transportation innovators? I'm honored to introduce our three panelists today. Representative Barbara Smith Warner was appointed to the legislature in 2014 to represent House District 45. Representative Smith Warner served on the Joint Committee on Transportation Modernization, which wrote and passed the $5.3 billion transportation package in the 2017 session. Commissioner Jessica Vega Pederson serves on the Multnomah County Board of Commissioners representing District 3. Commissioner Vega Pederson previously served as a state representative in the Oregon Legislature, where she was the first Latina elected to the House. As a Multnomah County Commissioner, Commissioner Pederson represents the county at various regional transportation tables. As Associate Director of First Stop Portland at Portland State University, Sarah Iannarone hosts hundreds of leaders from around the world every year who travel here to learn about our region's approach to transportation and urban planning. As co-founder of the Arleta Triangle Project and the Arleta Library Cafe, she worked for over a decade to help her neighborhood become more vibrant, connected, and walkable. Our moderator today is Steph Routh. She's the former executive director of Oregon Walks and currently serves as communications and marketing manager at the Community Cycling Center. She co-hosts the Why Isn't Anyone Talking About This podcast. Please welcome our speakers.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all for being here. For those who are joining us here at the Sentinel Hotel, unless you come from the future or a wizarding school, you neither teleported nor apparated here. You came from using a transportation mode or three on your way to join us, and we're thankful that you did. As Lisa said, today we will be talking about how the 2017 transportation package impacts the future of a transportation system we participate in every day and which must accommodate our needs going forward. So let's get into it. In 30 seconds or less, could each of you, I know, could each of you start with a strong opinion on the topic of the transportation package?
Yes. My opinion about the package is that I think it's a great example of what you can do when you really spend a lot of time and effort traveling throughout the state, talking to communities, large and small, rural and urban, and really taking their feedback, which was primarily, as somebody who served on that committee and went to those more than a dozen meetings, which was across the state, Portland congestion is a priority, transit is a priority for every community. And I believe that in taking that input and then working for 5 more months in a bipartisan, bicameral way, I think we put together the best package that we could for the time that we are in now.
So I think we had an incredible investment from our state in transportation that doesn't go near far enough to solve our regional transportation challenges that we have. There's a lot to love about the transportation package, including the fact that they made investments in the Portland area, really addressed issues statewide on transit investment that had been missing in our state, addressed safe routes to school, address some of the orphan highway problems, like Powell Boulevard, which we know is one of the highest crash corridors in our state, especially in East Portland, and did a lot of good in those ways. But it also didn't address some of the other questions that we have, the investment that we need in urban centers on the big transportation challenges, really having a vision and really embracing the multimodal future that we need to have for the Portland area.
I don't like the bike tax.
Okay. That was definitely less than 30 seconds. Great, thank you.
I think people know why.
The 2017 transportation package is described by many as the largest single investment in transportation the state has ever made. It generates, as Lisa said, $5.3 billion with a B in revenue through a bevy of new funding, including a higher gas tax, vehicle registration fee increase, a 0.1% payroll tax, 0.5% tax on new car sales, and, as Sarah mentioned, the bicycle excise tax. Locally, the largest projects identified include adding lanes to 3 highways and replacing the Abernathy Bridge. Roughly $100 million will fund public transportation investments throughout the state, and over $10 million in funding for the Safe Routes to School program, providing street safety improvements so more youth can walk and bike to and from school safely. Starting with you, Commissioner, how does that connect with the regional plan?
Yes, so I alluded to this a little bit in my previous answer, but it makes a good first start to the things that we need to do here as a region. It addresses some of the issues in the Portland area that we heard about across the state as being priorities, the major of those being the bottleneck issues in the Portland area that were preventing goods and services from other parts of the state from getting to where they needed to go. But it didn't address, an issue that we have here in terms of finishing the commitment that we've made to transit with the Southwest Corridor project. It didn't really address that we need in terms of seismic reliability of our roads and our bridges here, and we know that's something that we need to do. And it really doesn't go far enough in terms of the priorities and the values that we have as a region in bringing multimodal access and transit equity in our region that we know we need to do as well. So those are still things that we need to work on. But I know that there's a plan, so I like to say this, that the legislature did some great work, but they made a whole lot more work for those of us in the region that we're working on now. I'm currently sitting on 4 different boards or task force or work groups looking at everything from value pricing and congestion pricing in the Portland area, which is a solution we have not considered yet, and hats off for the legislature for making that a priority. Talking about the investment that we need to make in transit to make sure that it is serving low-income communities, that it's being invested in an equitable way, and then looking at how we're already spending the dollars that we get from the federal government and the state. So there's a lot of work that's being done now, but we need to really continue to have conversations that bring in all different voices on what we want our regional solution to be and where we want to go in terms of the next step of making a really large commitment to our regional transportation system.
I hear you talking about the relationship between aspirations and limited resources. Similarly, Sarah, can I ask you, how does this fit in? We have in the city, the Fixing Our Streets city gas tax increase, as well as federal and regional funds. So how does the transportation package, do you see, interact with the city's aspirations that it has for itself?
Well, we really need to rethink how we're going to pay for our transportation aims in the future, right? As we look at gas tax revenue continuously dropping, we need to be creative in rethinking what are the revenue streams for transportation going to be. We can't just keep retrofitting the gas tax for the future that we want. So we talk about congestion pricing, but even that doesn't go far enough in my estimation. We really need to think about how we can use the technology at our disposal to think about vehicle miles traveled, think about ways that we're going to incorporate equity into congestion pricing, think about how we can look beyond freeways to congestion pricing our arterials, otherwise we're going to be backing up into our neighborhoods, and really thinking even beyond pricing roads. There's a lot of economists that think that, oh, if you price the roads, then you'll start to have a better equation of how things are supposed to look. But I think we need to start thinking as a community, what do we value as a common good? What do we want to have? Like, what is your vision for East Portland? And then come up with a price tag, and then come up with a creative mechanism for paying for it locally. Because like they said on the housing forum here last week, I think we can count on the feds not stepping up increasingly, especially around our transit aims, right? They might pay for our freeway repaving and widening, but I doubt that the federal share of transit investments is going to increase. So a little bit more creativity would be my suggestion.
I've also heard a little bit about like different funding mechanisms and the equity and some of the conversations around how we're going to pay for different roads. Representative, what were some of the trade-offs that were made during all the conversations around the package?
You know, gas tax has been the go-to for so long on transportation. And it's striking that indeed, for all of the shortfalls that there continue to be, the fact that we as a city and as a region and as a state have continued to utilize that. The feds have not raised the gas tax since the 1990s. And we have raised a couple times in the state. There's been city additions. And so there was a lot of... It seemed to be a big innovation, even though I still, because I wasn't there before, I don't understand why. The conversations about congestion pricing felt like a big give, honestly. To even have them in the language of the bill seemed like a really big deal, even though I would argue, and I think many of I think everyone here would agree, that that's one of those things that you can't truly make an impact on congestion without it. And so that was pretty significant. There were conversations about other kinds of taxes. There was aggregate, which is used in road building. There was a proposal in the conversation about, well, who is going to get a lot of new business if new roads is going to be part of this? The aggregate folks. So how about if we put a tax on that and use it in a very targeted way to some of the areas like Connect Oregon and other projects that we are having the declining revenues for? That did not make it through. There was significant conversation, but that did not make it through. However, it's on the table. To me, even having the conversation as much as we did is a big deal. We also had a pretty interesting conversation that ended up with the excise tax on new cars, because as people may or may not know, gas tax revenue can only go into the state highway fund. And so one of our challenges when we were trying to figure out how do we get a dedicated revenue source for transit? And I just want to say again, that's a pretty big deal, not only to get for the first time, but I think it's really important the message it sends about the state's priorities, that we determined that this is a state priority and we need to have a dedicated source for it. But that excise tax was an attempt to, how do we get some resources so that we can stay out of that requirement of gas taxes to only go to highway funds? We have other things, a lot of other things we want to fund. And the excise tax on new car sales, there was discussion about having it be new and used. There were discussions about what level it was going to be at. And we ended up with 0.5% and just on new cars. And we already are expecting a lawsuit saying that that is, and I am not their lawyer, so I am not sure exactly what the premise is. But coming up with new resources like that was another, I think, another accomplishment of the package.
Steph, can I add to that? I think one of the things that is important is that this package did add an investment for transit that wasn't that cannot be part of the gas tax. So there was another mechanism for that. When we look at how the highway, what the Highway Trust Fund is, it really says that, well, the people who use the roads, damage the roads, and in order to build roads and maintain roads, we should then, have like this user fee that comes out of the gas tax. But it doesn't take into consideration the other impacts that cars on the road have, which is that it adds to congestion, which takes up time, which creates pollution and emits carbon into our atmosphere. So there's all these other impacts of roads plus people. It's not just about it. And so that's where the limit is. If you look at other cities across the country that have actually made big investments in transit, they've been able to do that using revenue functions and tools that we don't have, such as the sales tax, right? LA is getting over $800 million a year for a huge transit investment. but they're able to do that because they're adding a bit onto their sales tax to do that. So it's just a different tool, and it really does shape the conversation of how we're able to do things regionally and statewide here.
I just want to pause and say that it is a testament to the brilliance of you all that I don't even know which question to ask yet because there are so many. But I'll ask this one because you guys all talked about congestion. The transportation package lays the groundwork for 3 major freeway expansion projects in the metro area, adding lanes to I-5 through the Rose Quarter, adding lanes to 205 and replacing the Abernathy Bridge, and also adding lanes to 217. The Oregon Transportation Commission identifies that congestion, as you mentioned, is a serious and growing problem, particularly in urban areas like Portland. Yet many studies have demonstrated that widening freeways generally only leads to induced demand and short-term congestion relief. So what are your priorities for long-term congestion relief, and how do these priorities fit in?
I'll just start briefly, which is, I think this is an example of there's not one solution to congestion. And we can't say, okay, we're just going to do this one thing and that'll fix it. We need to acknowledge the fact that there are specific choke points, and when we have opportunities to deal with them, to do that, and layer on congestion pricing as another way, and continue to fund transit and find alternatives to one person in one car driving to work. And I would argue we need to expand our vision of transportation and congestion to realize that it also includes people not being able to afford to live where they work and work where they live. So planning has an element to that, and working on more affordable housing has a significant element on that. Because if you work on those bigger picture items, all of that has to work together. So I would just say that expanding our view of the causes of congestion to include that incredibly important element of housing, affordable housing, where people can and can't afford to live and how they can get around there, I think you have to bring all of that into the umbrella.
So I'm not a fan of congestion. It's not fun. It's frustrating. It's annoying. And how we deal with it. I mean, I really agree with a lot of what with Representative Smith-Warner has said. And I think that we have to look at the tools that we have, value pricing, congestion pricing, but also know that there are impacts to that. There's an equity question that needs to be answered and how that affects people who are trying to get from place to place. We know it's going to have an effect of when you have people who are saying, I'm not going to take the voluntary trip, or maybe I'm going to take a different route. It's going to have impact on our side streets and our neighborhood streets. So we need to really address it from a system-wide transportation solution, and that's why we need a lot of voices at the table to say, what does that look like? We need to make it easier and safer for people to walk, ride their bike, or take a bus, or take a MAX, or to get around from place to place. And that is a way of making it more attractive and viable for people to stay out of their cars and to take an alternate means of transportation. And I talk about East Portland like every panel I'm on, but I really believe that, for people who live in East Portland who don't even have a sidewalk to get down to the end of their block, talking about how are they going to get from where they live to a bus stop, which is farther away than bus stops in other parts of the city, and then try to get to a job that's farther away from the downtown core. It takes a lot of time and commitment. So we really need to be addressing equity issues, housing issues, as we're having this conversation about congestion and transportation.
I'm a little troubled how our conversation is unfolded here in Portland. As someone who interacts with people from around the world often, the first calls I got when they heard Portland had a bike tax were from Boston and Brazil. What? I came there to study platinum level bicycle infrastructure. What do you mean you have a bicycle excise tax now? And similar with things like the freeway widening project, our traded sector here is so important to our economy, and it's so important that we have our freeways open so that freight can move freely here. Those are good family wage jobs, and they're important pathways to opportunity for many people who may not have pipelines into, say, the knowledge economy, right? So we need to make sure that our streets are free from from congestion. But when you talk about it in terms of freeway widening, to me, again, that seems counter to the Portland narrative, which is something that we replicate day in and day out, right? We're thinking about Portland not as this end game, but as this thing that we do. And one of the things that we don't do here is build highways. So I understand that we need to put money into highway maintenance and that we are going to need to do road expansions, but how we even frame these projects to the public and what we're prioritizing when we talk about them is key. So part of it is that vision that you mentioned, which is what is the vision for what we're trying to get to on the other side of everyone stuck on I-84 and I-5? Is anyone describing that? What does it look like? Is it automated buses that are solving that last mile problem out of East Portland into arterial buses, into bus rapid transit? Like, what is our goal? What are we trying to solve for? Because I don't think we should spend a cent on widening I-5 until we've actually implemented congestion pricing and tried to see the impacts. So we don't even have good priorities set right now. And part of that is, I think, regional leadership here. And I see some folks, Lynn Pederson's in the room, she's running for Metro President. People who are going to set a vision for us about what our regional transportation future looks like are going to be increasingly important.
For our broadcast audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Steph Routh, and I'm speaking with Commissioner Jessica Vega Pederson, Representative Barbara Smith-Warner, and Sarah Iannarone on the future of transportation in Portland. You've all mentioned transportation equity a number of times. I feel like we talk about equity in a lot of different contexts. How would you define transportation equity?
So I think transportation equity to me looks like we're answering the question of what transportation looks like, talking beyond just roads, bridges, and sidewalks, and really looking at the impact of the communities and how we're building our communities through our transportation decisions. And it's making sure that the investments we're making are fair and equitable to the entire population, and especially those lower income folks. I mean, that's to me is we're making something that's at its core kind of making sure that we're making dollars investments that help support those for whom past decisions have had the hardest impact.
And I don't have much to add to that, except for I've been having conversations about equity in a lot of different forums, and we've had also a lot of conversations about how equity is not equality. And that is often the hardest thing for folks who otherwise would be supportive to really understand. That equity doesn't mean giving everybody the same amount. It means giving more to the places that historically have not had it or that just plain need it now. So that being an element, we had a lot of conversations during this bill process where there is a balance of the rest of the state believing that Portland is getting too much, and Portland believing that the rest of the state gets a disproportionate amount compared to the volume and population here. And so that equity versus equality conversation is one that needs to continue to be at the forefront as we have these conversations.
There was an article that came out recently looking at Cleveland's Smart Cities grant that they got, because they really won that on the equity analysis that they did, and they were going to try and solve for equity there. And they're really struggling with that, because what they're finding is equity doesn't trickle down, right? You can't just make transit investments all over Portland and expect suddenly East Portland's going to be well served by transit. We have to really be focusing on what gauges are we going to move the needle on. Is it about access in communities of color to employment and education? Is it going to be making sure that people from neighborhoods that aren't connected can actually walk, to a transit stop within X number of feet? Like, I think we should have some clear indicators around transportation equity that we should be solving for, the same way we did around greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. We said we were going to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and then when we started to look at policies, we said, how does this start to reduce that and help us move the needle on that? So for me, it really would be about solving what I would call the access deserts and the mobility deserts, where people are just so disconnected. You go beyond 122nd Avenue here in Portland, there's no car sharing, there's no bike sharing. The buses are infrequent and sometimes unreliable, and so all the bike share in the world in the central city isn't going to help folks out there, and I think we need to think about that a little bit.
And I'll just add as a point of personal privilege, in addition to location, I also think a lot of, in terms of our service related to time, that you have people working the swing shift in certain areas, and that there are modes that are just not feasible for that reason. I want to shift us just a tiny bit to growth. Growth in Portland and the region. It is happening. More people arrive in the region than leave every day, whether it's through the birth canal or the port or the airport or interstate. So housing and transportation must be intertwined to manage that growth. Thank you. So I want to start with you, Sarah. For people to actually live affordably, they need both affordable housing and affordable transportation. How can we leverage recent transportation investments to maintain and create affordable housing in areas well served by transit, bicycling, and walking in particular?
Well, I think the regional partnerships will be key. I mean, things coming out of Metro like a regional housing strategy, so that we're concentrating limited investments and targeting them around existing transit areas, and proposed future transit areas is going to be very important, as you mentioned, because the housing and transportation are inextricable. We really need to be looking at that. So thinking about that as a region is going to be key. Municipality by municipality isn't going to serve our needs, especially when you look at disparities between, say, places like Washington County and Multnomah County with regard to affordability and access to transit in both places. Beyond that, I think thinking in terms of compact neighborhoods and workforce development around, so that we're reducing the vehicle miles traveled that people have to use. So thinking about things like education centers. Portland State wasn't successful on its regional education bond, but if that had been more closely connected to, say, things like community college campuses near transit and things like that, we can be leveraging our transit investments and our transportation investments for our economic development goals as well.
I would just comment that, just to be clear, this isn't only a Portland issue. As I said, we were in Redmond, we were in Hermiston, we were in Medford, we were in Newport, and everywhere they're having the same conversation regardless of size. And the other, I think another thing that struck me was that what transit is going to look like in those communities is not necessarily going to be what it would look like here. Whether it's the need for kind of a spoken hub, small bus system, whether it is using shared ride services in some sort of, through some sort of centralized transit. It really is a priority for moving workers around to jobs and seniors. The senior population is growing not only in the country, but here in Oregon, and those two populations were who was mentioned most prominently as we traveled across the state, and were reminded that transit is not just, not to mention affordable housing. Some of the greatest increases in housing costs have been in Central Oregon and in Hood River. So it is not just a Portland problem, and so I would hope that we will work to share strategies across, because even though a rural area and an urban area may end up with different solutions, the ability to share their kind of innovative ideas that they come up with really shouldn't be missed.
Thank you. And I think a lot of times we think of transit in terms of fixed transit, but thinking about the unfunded mandate of paratransit for universal accessibility and curb-to-curb access in places where there are no curbs, for example. And again, back to you, what does the legislature have left to do then? Right.
Oh, we're good. I think we're done.
Burnside Bridge.
Oh, Burnside Bridge, yeah. So in the short term, there are some kind of technical fixes, as there always are, that we're likely to do from 2018, but please don't ask me what specifically they are, because they are mostly pretty technical. It was like a 250-page bill, House Bill 2017. So there were things like that. Going forward, there's a couple things. Number one, there was a lot of discussion about accountability in our transportation conversation and in this bill. And so there was some, if you're a transportation geek, there was a lot of geeking out on specific accountability details about, but the point of the story being, this is a big investment. how do we make sure that not only we believe it's being spent in the right way, but that the community, that the taxpayers believe it is and or can see that it is. So we added, we maintained our joint committee that put the bill together going forward to kind of supervise and keep an eye on and make sure that there was public information about all of these projects, because we are indeed focused here on some of the bigger projects in the Portland area, but though the increase in the gas tax and the reg fees, that money there's a split, that half of it goes to the state, to the Oregon Department of Transportation for use on statewide projects, and 30% goes to the counties and 20% goes to the cities. So there will be projects and work all across the state, and the committee is going to try to oversee that and maintain clearer lines of information, websites where you can check on projects and whether they're on schedule and on budget. And then going forward, we are going to need to keep pushing the congestion pricing and the looking for other funding options. The pay per mile that Sarah mentioned, I joke that, the thing about pay per mile is that people don't like the big brother aspect of it, right? Oh, I don't want to tell the state, have them put a thing in my car and it'll tell them how many miles I drove every year. Well, I argue that if we could just do some sort of a joint operating agreement with Pokemon Go, it seemed that nobody minded telling the Pokemon Go people where they were at every moment. So I think that is our way to get vehicle miles traveled. Thank you for giving me a public forum for that. I can die happy now.
I think the representative just entered a bill called the Pokemon bill. This is beautiful.
But so going forward, I believe we still have a lot of work to do on coming up with new revenue sources and really kind of rethinking, will we have another big bill like this in the future? I'm not sure. We may shift to more regional approaches, whether it's because of the kind of resources we need, sales tax, other things like that. But regardless, we need to keep managing these and also seeking new ways that will match our needs and also reflect our values.
Commissioner, do you have anything to add?
Oh, I always have things that I think the legislature should be working on.
Hey, you left of your own accord.
I know, I did. No, I think that a couple of things that we just know that we're going to need to work on, because there are issues that affect the state, are, the orphan highway question, right? The transfer of some of those orphan highways around the state to local jurisdictions is a really important thing, but we know that is unfinished business. We have roads like 82nd that, are still not where they need to be and are under ODOT's control. And we also do have to look, about seismic reliability, across the state. It's definitely an issue here in the Portland region, but definitely in the coast and other areas of the state as well. So I think that there are, things that, again, are big issues, but we can work on and attack, with a statewide focus.
And you've mentioned orphan highways a couple of times. Could you just share a little bit what it is?
I use jargon. Okay, yes, I'd be happy to. Yeah, so orphan highways are those that are actually managed by the Oregon Department of Transportation, but really act more as local or regional roads. So Powell Boulevard would be considered a state highway. 82nd Avenue would be considered a state highway, even though when most people who live around those roads and streets think about them, they don't think of them as a state access.
You don't think of it as 26, you think of it as Powell Boulevard. And I'd just like to say that there are orphan highway problems in other parts of the state as well. And on just a quick throw out about, to reinforce your idea, your comment about earthquake readiness. One of the most striking conversations that I can't stop thinking about after doing this is in the kind of long-range planning about earthquakes, there is this already kind of being worked on premise that I-5 will be lost and that 97 will be the primary north-south connector for the state. And that so that we need to figure out a way to reinforce, to basically, what can we do to have 97 so that if that, God forbid, comes to pass, that it is in a situation where it can indeed continue to serve that.
For our broadcast audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Steph Routh, and I'm speaking with Commissioner Jessica Vega Pederson, Representative Barbara Smith-Warner, and Sarah Iannarone on the future of transportation in Portland. I want to move. I feel like we've been talking a little bit about maintenance and capital projects, and I think seismic retrofit definitely comes in. And Commissioner, I want to throw this to you first. There's always this tension between how do we fund capital projects for our emerging needs and maintenance, ensure maintenance both for the inventory that we already have, as well as, you know, how are we booking the maintenance of the capital projects that we're currently building into the future. And particularly for county, you have the bridges, which has serious seismic issues, a few of them, and as well as a large inventory of county roads. Mm-hmm. So how are you looking related to this transportation package as the relationship between what our maintenance needs are, what our capital needs are, and where this package brought us?
Yeah, so we do, Multnomah County is responsible for 6 of the bridges that cross the Willamette River. And you know, if in case you haven't noticed, there have been a lot of projects that we've been working on over the bridges if you tried to get from one side of the city to the another. Because there are maintenance projects that need to be done, that have to be done. I mean, we've replaced huge pieces of the bridge on components that are almost 100 years old that absolutely couldn't wait any longer. And those are really just making sure that they work on a day-to-day level, not if they're ready for some kind of, you know, earthquake or seismic event that we know is very likely to happen. And that's going to take bigger investment, and that's going to take a lot of investment. So we are really focusing right now on the Burnside Bridge as that bridge that we want to make sure is seismically resilient, because the Burnside Road itself is a lifeline corridor for our region. It goes from Gresham all the way out to Washington County. And so this is where we're focusing on our efforts. We have a project right now called Earthquake Ready Burnside Bridge, which is looking at those options. What would be the best way to make it seismically resilient? And we've got county staff here who've been working really hard to best plan for that. Though it's, like I said, it's going to be a big investment, but the cost of not doing anything and then having a Cascadia event happen would be way, way more expensive.
Can I put a plug in for your cool video too? Multnomah County has that disaster, what if the Burnside Bridge crashes video. You should all Google it and watch it. It's amazing.
Sarah or Representative, either of you on maintenance versus capital?
I will just say briefly that I think we had a lot of conversation during the development of this package about how we could move from doing a package every, 6 to 12 years to establishing something for the long term that would just kind of maintain itself, and we did not get there. We made some significant progress, but we still, whether it's mostly the whole declining revenue of gas tax and need for other funding mechanisms, but I don't think we are there yet on maintaining the resources that we have. One of my colleagues who was on the committee ran some numbers on all of how much it would cost to bring every road, just every bridge and culvert, I think, not even the roads, every bridge and culvert in the state up to good or better, and that alone would have required a 49-cent increase in the gas tax. So we didn't get there, but that's that still, we also didn't get to establishing a system that would kind of be self-maintaining going forward, and so I would say that's kind of one significant miss that we had in this package.
We've talked a lot about different funding mechanisms and the fact that the gas tax is declining, and that and also this tension that we want to fund the things that we want to incentivize, and we don't want to tax the things that we want to incentivize. I know you're not supposed to have favorites, but if you could wave a magic wand, what funding mechanism would you either increase or put in place?
I'll just start with congestion pricing. It's used so, because it's not just a revenue, but because of the impact that it can have on actual congestion. I would just say there was some kind of aside mention of it in the last transportation package that didn't go anywhere. And so I'm particularly excited that we've already put a group together that's going to put a submission into the feds about how we can do it here. It's been used really successfully in Washington State. If you look to the north, it's rather ironic that there seem to be members of Congress who think that they can decide what Oregon can do about our congestion issues when, well, it's a rather oddly paternalistic, well, we're going to use this to work on our congestion issues, but you, Oregon, we're going to tell you that you can't. To which I say, no thanks. We'll figure out our own way. So that would be my preference.
And I'm going to second that. I mean, I think that we have the ability to actually do congestion pricing and shape it in a way that reflects our values that we have as a city, as a region, and as a state, which is a very exciting. I'm really happy to be part of that conversation. And it doesn't require a constitutional change to do, which is also a really big thing.
Since they already took congestion pricing, I'll take a regional infrastructure fund. We need to think of some regional tax sharing mechanisms for infrastructure investments here. If we can't get out in front of that, we've done a great job hyper-locally with tax increment financing and urban renewal, and I think we need to think about how are we going to generate funds across districts, whether those are transportation districts, but also just even as a region, how are we going to build out that essential infrastructure? So that would be my magic wand, because that's a pretty heavy lift.
Okay, I think this might be my last question, but I want you to be very long-winded if you feel like it. What is one dream you have for the future of transportation in Oregon? And I will start, just because I get to, because I have a microphone. I would love to see, I think a lot about aging in place and paratransit. I think about this a lot, and I would love to see some form of zoning, some requirement that any multifamily senior housing center has to be within a certain hundreds of feet from a frequent service bus line or max. I think that that it is a huge issue that we have a lot of senior living centers that are being placed where land is cheap, and we're isolating people who have helped build this state, and we owe more. They deserve more.
So I don't have a bigger picture one, but I got to say, I keep thinking about whether we could be like a Denmark or somewhere where the bike and car infrastructure is so well laid out and integrated that not only is it commonplace, but I'm just struck that hardly people don't wear helmets because the infrastructure is so safe, and it's not without whatever, but the idea that I don't know if we could do that for the whole state, but that was a conscious decision and a planning decision that they made. It didn't just happen that way. So I would just like to do a shout out, whether it's Vision Zero or other planning work, the idea that we could be in a situation where pedestrian and bike transportation and commuting was so safe that indeed we achieved Vision Zero and really made this a different city and a different state for the future.
I look at pictures from Portland 100 years ago, before the automobile, and I think it only took 10 years for us to retrofit our city away from the horse and buggy to the automobile. So wouldn't it be great if in 10 years we could be post single occupancy vehicle? What would it mean to be able to live in Portland without having to be automobile dependent, say if you weren't like single, able-bodied, living within a few miles of your job, right? Like I imagine a Portland where autocentricity and actually the ideology that an automobile is good living is a thing of the past here. And that as a community, we don't think of that in terms of, oh, let's not be an automobile city, but let's be a place where we're putting people and the environment first. So we're thinking about air quality. So they've got car-free zones now in Europe because the air quality is so bad. Well, let's not get there again, right? And we're worried about cyclist safety and pedestrian safety. Well, if speed limits are based around humans and not automobiles, well, that Vision Zero and 20 is plenty becomes moot, because speed limits that work for pedestrians and cyclists are much, much, much lower than the posted speed limits. So I think even just shifting our mindset toward building places that work for humans foremost, as opposed to single occupancy vehicles primarily, is my dream of a better Portland.
So my vision of transportation is one where we have 100% moved away from gas-powered engines of fueling our transportation need. We have electrified our transportation sector. We've made the investments that we need in transit so that we have high-speed access to and from the downtown core to Gresham and Wilsonville and Hillsborough. We have a bus system, a streetcar system, a bus rapid transit system, or even a smaller bus system where transit is all about accessibility to all parts of our region, to all parts of our community. And we've made those investments in a way where people who live further away from their workforce have an easier time accessing the transit instead of the harder time accessing the transit. And then finally, that it's, that it's safer and easier to walk and bike all over our city. And I guess it would say that where people are just sharing, not just having like autonomous vehicles or electric powered autonomous vehicles, but vehicles where there's shared ownership models so that not everyone needs to own their own car, but they can have access to it, sharing it in a pool in a community sense instead of a single owner sense.
So it sounds like we're all trying to get the gas tax revenue to zero.
Bingo.
And now that we've decided that, let's go to Q&A. Shall we? Okay, so let's now go to the audience for some questions. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for staff to collect. You can also submit questions through Twitter using the hashtag #FridayForum. I'll try and read at least one index card and one question from Twitter. We invite City Club members to ask their questions at the microphone. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. I've always wanted to say that. Please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less.
Hi, Chris Smith, City Club member. Delighted to hear everyone on the panel endorse congestion pricing. I share the view that it's the best single tool that we have to deal with congestion in urban areas. Struggling with the investment at I-5 Rose Quarter. We know that adding lanes in an urban context, you really limit the ability to deal with congestion because of the effect of induced demand. If you make the freeway easier to drive on, more people will drive on it. So my question is, why wouldn't we try congestion pricing first before we put $500 million into lanes that are likely to be very ineffective?
So I will try that. I would just say that this project in particular is not just freeway widening. This is a combination of, there are very few highway projects such as this that also involve, due to some good joint work locally, that also involve increased bike and pedestrian access, bringing together of neighborhoods, the work that is involved on the covering of the area as well. That I think that is a significant opportunity that this project brings in a way that other freeway projects don't. And I believe that given the timing, we have until 2018 to make our proposal for congestion pricing to the feds. Depending on the timeline for approval, we could indeed start that first, because the planning forefront on that project and the engineering is going to take a chunk of time anyway. And I believe that both the lanes and the combination of bike ped and other neighborhood enhancements that brings, I'm supportive of it for that reason.
Yeah, and I don't think it has to be an either-or proposition. I would like to see both solutions. I mean, I harken back to my days in the technology industry. I think that the highways going to 2 lanes, right there is a design flaw that we have to fix because we know it's causing more accidents and it's created congestion a situation where it's not just during the morning and evening rush hour, but it's happening all day long. And I'm really excited about the additional things in addition to extending lanes of this project that have to do with, like you said, connecting communities, being a part of the works that's being proposed with Albina Vision and helping create that vision through capping and bringing bike and pedestrian access to that area.
I don't know why we're not having conversations about getting I-5 out of the center of our city. Frankly, I think it's ugly. The Central East Side is amazing, and I think we should be having some big conversations about what a post-I-5 central city in Portland looks like. So I'm with you, Chris. I don't really know. I don't have a good answer for that one.
Jim Zarin, City Club member. Several references have been made to what's going on in Europe, and one that's not been mentioned is high-speed rail, and I wanted to raise it because I think they figured out that domestic flights in Europe really don't need to exist because high-speed rail can compete, and so they turned them out like it's no big deal anymore. We can't seem to get it going anyplace, and just think if we could have high-speed rail here to Seattle and to Eugene, all that traffic would not have to go to the airport. I don't know what the exact figure is, but I think it'd probably close half the gates. I think they have 15 minutes flights to Seattle every day out of the airport. We could get rid of them and use that space for flights that go outside of Oregon. And all the traffic down to Eugene, traffic to Vancouver, BC, et cetera. So I guess I'm just curious about what thoughts you have. It's a lot of money, but what thoughts you have about the benefit that high-speed rail may bring, not only to get people from downtown Portland to those other cities downtown, but also to relieve the traffic congestion that going to airports and freeing up gates at the airport.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea, and it's a model that we should look at nationally, because that is it is an expensive project, and that's one where we know we're going to have federal investment to make projects like that work. But there's no reason why we can't begin to look at it. And I know that there's some private entities that are looking at the technology of having really high-speed access. And I think it's something that we could definitely be a part of. I would love to see a bigger federal commitment to those kinds of visionary projects. I think we heard some of that from the Obama administration, but we haven't heard anything like that.
Bill Dickey, City Club member. I actually started getting boiling blood in this Friday forum today, listening to transportation issues. I mean, last night, for example, I tried to take my mail from Irvington to the Hoyt Street Post Office to get it delivered and couldn't get through the Rose Quarter. And it's because of the Trailblazers and the great activity that goes on at the Rose Quarter and the unbelievable congestion that the Rose Quarter has. And so we definitely need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time in this town and do lots of different things at the same time, improving lots of different areas. But the Rose Quarter needs more lanes and it needs more traffic planning to make the city happen. That's my statement without a question.
Hey, well, let's ask a question from the audience. You all mentioned East Portland. What efforts are underway to make East Portland more connected to the Central City? Are there initiatives within the Central City Plan and Green Loop to help this connection?
Well, you just mentioned one, I'm thinking of it as the East Side bicycle loop, some platinum infrastructure, cycling infrastructure out there. But I do think that the money in the new package for Powell Boulevard is actually quite good. As someone who lives right on Powell Boulevard and fears death every day, I'm thankful for that money. Some of the more community-oriented tools, too, of placemaking. You're seeing a lot more mixed-use development going out in transit areas out there. The new town center in Lentz, there's an awful lot of new development there where we've had over a decade of infrastructure investments, a lot of Prosper Portland money out there, too, and TriMet and Metro. Metro. So I'm excited to see some of our plans coming to fruition ultimately as the market heats up. But I even just think things like the speed cameras and some of the things on Division that PBOT's been able to implement around Vision Zero as well are helping, especially on between about 122nd and 148th on Division, some increased enforcement out there. You've seen a noticeable change. So slowly but surely chipping away at it.
So every time I see PBOT Director Leah Treat, I always ask her, how are those East Portland Greenway projects going? There are plans to do more bike greenway and safe bike routes throughout East Portland, and I want to see those actually funded and implemented and have good connections to the Green Loop. But those are really my priorities. There are other projects that have been happening. There's a bus rapid transit project that is going up Division all the way out into East Portland that makes investments in making it easier for people to get back and forth from East Portland. And as Sarah said, there's been a lot of investments both from the state and locally on making it safer to cross the street, to walk, and to bike around East Portland. So we just need to continue to build on those efforts.
Hi, my name is Sally Bachman. I'm a new member of the City Club. I'm thrilled to see so many powerful women on the panel. I know that women really get things done, and one thing I'd really love to see get done is a conversation to begin between Portland and the Vancouver and Southwest Washington area over transit and transportation. And I was surprised to learn, I think, from this conversation that I-5 is toast if we get a really big earthquake, and one of the reasons perhaps is because the I-5 bridges across the Columbia River will be toast themselves. So I wanted to know if anybody in Oregon is talking with anyone in Southwest Washington and Vancouver, given past history and everything, and if there's any hope for some solution to the seismic danger, not to mention the volume issue of half of our commute shed. And by the way, metro areas are defined by their commute shed these days. So, you know, a good portion of our commute shed is in Vancouver and Southwest Washington. So what dialogue is going on there, and is there any hope?
Well, the problem still exists. Regardless of anything and everything that's happened over the last 5 to 10 years, we still have a bridge that is structurally problematic on the earthquake front. We still have the only red light on I-5 from Canada to Mexico because we have there's the structural issues, but also the fact that it goes up and down. It's the only freeway bridge that does that I'm aware of. Maybe there are ones on the East Coast, but so that it is still a problem, and we still have, and I think that there is growing demand, I would think / hope from the folks who live in Vancouver and who are commuting over here. But the ball, honestly, is in Washington's court right now. The last series of discussions between the two states were abruptly ended by the Washington side. And so I would argue that I agree with you that it's still important, and the ball is in Washington's court. And I will take this opportunity to say once again that I do not believe members of Congress from Washington should get to decide any element of what we are doing on to manage our transportation and our congestion problems here in Oregon.
Hi, I'm Ashley Henry with Business for a Better Portland. I'm a City Club member, and I had the opportunity recently to travel to Denver with some of you here in this room, and we met with the Denver Regional Chamber of Commerce, and it was really inspiring to hear about the level of regional collaboration that exists there between the business community and advocates, both in transit advocates as well as environmental advocates. And we learned that in a recent ballot measure campaign, the Chamber of Commerce there actually hosted some Sierra Club campaign staff to collaborate with them on site. And I was just curious to our elected officials if you could speak what from the business community would be helpful as you look ahead to the challenges that you see at the regional level.
So full disclosure, I was on the Denver trip that Ashley was talking about, and we did get to hear about that. I think that that's a really wonderful question, because we do need to have a partnership between all of our community members, including the business community, as we address these problems. I think one of the things that would be most helpful would be just an open dialogue and conversation about addressing what the needs are, and especially from a workforce development and job outlook perspective, so that we know where they expect the jobs to be, what their biggest challenges are now that they're facing and that their employees are facing, and that how they can be part of the process of addressing the transportation decisions that will be made, very shortly in terms of what we want to do in our region. So I think having the good conversation, having access to their ideas and data and information, and then, if we're going to have to do a campaign, we're always going to need help with fundraising and running that campaign.
And due to the cruelty of time, we have to leave it there. Thank you all very much for being part of this.
We are out of broadcast time and have to stop for today. If this program has inspired you to join or contribute to City Club, you can do so at the registration table as you leave the room. This is Lisa Watson from City Club's Board of Governors. Thank you to our guests, and special thanks to Colin Jones and James Ofsink and the entire Government and Public Policy Issue Forum Committee for their hard work. We are adjourned.